This is Egypt, ancient Egypt. When you open your eyes, you are in a world unlike anything you know. The desert stretches around you, silent, yet threatening. And life exists only along a thin line. That line is called the Nile. On one side, green, fertile lands extend. On the other, death waits in silence. Here, life depends on balance, and that balance can break at any moment. No one lives randomly. Every step, every decision has meaning. So, are you ready to live in ancient Egypt? The ancient Egyptians built their lives around the Nile River. Living beside this river was the greatest advantage for survival. Water, agriculture, trade, and transportation all were made possible by the Nile. The rest of the land was mostly desert, extremely dry, sandy, and rocky. Life on these lands depended on what the Nile provided, yet was tested by the harshness of the desert. The world you wake up to is both abundance and struggle. If you lived on these lands, the sun would be your clock. With the first light, the day would begin, and everyone would set in motion. There was no stopping, no delay. The moment you opened your eyes, you had to fall into this rhythm. But not everyone lived under the same conditions, and you could feel that difference the moment you stepped inside a home. Some people lived in larger spaces with more order and comfort, while others survived with far more limited means. So, which one would you wake up in? For most people, living space was extremely limited, and you had to share it with many others. Daily life unfolded in tight, crowded spaces where everyone adapted to this way of living. But this was only the beginning. Now imagine walking down this street and noticing that the movement around you never stops. As everyone rushes to get somewhere, you have to move forward within this flow without losing your direction. And you are part of this order as well. Morning hours passed quickly, and the day flowed rapidly into work. While some people merged into the intense pace, others were left behind, outside this order. In this world, staying afloat was not easy. The pyramids were built for the pharaohs, each made of millions of stone blocks. Completing these structures took years. But were such massive monuments really built just for burial? Imagine stepping inside. You are in a narrow, dark corridor, your torch barely lighting the walls. These passageways were not random. They were built according to a precise plan. Temples were sacred spaces built for the gods, and they stood at the center of daily life. Offerings were presented here, and rituals were carried out according to strict rules. The innermost parts of the temples were not open to everyone. Only priests were allowed to enter these areas. While rituals were performed for the gods on one side, on the other, there was a powerful system that controlled these rituals. Palaces were the places where the pharaoh lived and ruled the country. The decisions made here affected even the most distant villages. The pharaoh was not just a ruler, he was not to be defied. When you think about your own tomb being prepared, you realize it is not just a place of burial. Your life is carved into the walls, and what you owned is depicted through drawings. Here, death was seen as a continuation of life. The stones of these massive structures were often transported along the Nile. Heavy blocks were carried by boats, then hauled into place on land. So, the pyramids did not rise in the desert alone. They rose with the help of the river. In ancient Egypt, the foundation of the diet was barley and wheat, and bread was made from these grains. Bread was not just food, it was the staple consumed in almost every meal of the day. Ancient Egyptians often drank beer made from barley instead of water, because water was not always clean. This drink was both nourishing and provided a significant portion of their daily calories. The diet was not limited to bread. Foods like onions, garlic, and fish were also consumed. Thanks to the Nile, fish was an easily accessible source of protein, especially important for the lower classes. In ancient Egypt, trade was mostly done through barter, not with money. People tried to meet their needs by exchanging the goods they had. So, what would you trade, and for what? In ancient Egypt, one of the most common games was a board game called Senet. This game was not just for entertainment, it was also seen as a symbol of the journey after death. Music was an important part of entertainment and ritual in ancient Egypt. Instruments like harps, flutes, and drums were played, and people moved along with these rhythms. And you could have been among that crowd. At the end of the day, people would gather, if only for a short while, and rest. These moments were rare opportunities to shake off the day's exhaustion. But the same cycle would be waiting for you again the next day. When you looked at these streets, the first thing you would notice was the crowd. Houses stood very close together, and the roads were often narrow and irregular. People, animals, and loads all shared the same space. So within this density, how easy was it really to move? Imagine stepping into the crowd. With every step, you bump into someone. The streets are narrow, people are constantly in motion, and stopping is almost impossible. The noise around you never fades. Within the streets, small stalls would be set up, and people met their needs here. Bread, vegetables, fish, and everyday goods changed hands quickly. But these markets were not just for trade. At some stalls, there were only a few basic goods. At others, there was more variety and more valuable items. On one side, there was survival. On the other, profit. Life in the city was fast, and everyone was trying to get something done within the day. Shopping didn't take long. Everything was done quickly. There was no time to stop. Imagine standing in front of a stall, trying to choose the item in your hand. The seller is watching you, waiting for you to decide. Here, everything is fast. In ancient Egypt, when people looked at nature, they did not see just nature. The sun, the river, the sky were all accepted as gods. It was believed that there was a force behind every event. So, was everything truly governed by the gods? Imagine stepping into a temple. As you go deeper inside, the space grows darker and quieter. Towering walls and massive columns make you feel small. You are not alone here. Priests repeated specific rituals every day. Food was offered to the gods, prayers were spoken, and order was maintained. But the purpose of these rituals was not just worship. The people remained outside the temples, and most of the time, they could not enter. On one side, there were believers. On the other, priests who communicated with the gods. Belief belonged to everyone, but control was held by the few. Death in ancient Egypt was not seen as an end. The body was preserved and mummified because death was a transition. When you imagine your own death, you realize it is not the end. There is a tomb prepared for you and objects placed inside. A new journey begins. According to ancient Egyptian belief, after death, your heart would be weighed. Your good and your bad would determine the outcome, so your life would continue even after death. In ancient Egypt, most people spent their days working. Fields, construction, heavy labor were part of everyday life. Work was not just for survival, it was a necessity. So, was it possible to step outside this system? Imagine working under the sun. The heat, the exhaustion, the thirst, all weigh on you. Even if you want to rest, you have no chance to stop. Because here, working is the only way to survive. Not every job was heavy. Some people worked in crafts. Masters created, made tools, and prepared the items needed for daily life. But even these jobs were not as easy as you might think. Society was not the same for everyone, and this difference was clearly visible. On one side, there were people doing heavy labor. On the other, those who ruled and made decisions. In the same city, but living completely different lives. Imagine being within this crowd. You repeat the same task again and again. Everyone around you is part of the same system. You have no choice. At the very top of society stood the pharaoh. Beneath him were officials, priests, and other classes. Everyone had their place. This order did not change. The workforce in ancient Egypt was not entirely unstructured. People were organized into groups and assigned specific tasks. So this vast system did not run randomly. It moved forward with planning. Ancient Egypt was not just a civilization, it was also a powerful state. Borders were protected, and armies moved in an organized way. Thanks to this strength, it endured for a long time. So, what was it that kept this order standing? Imagine being a soldier, marching long distances with heavy equipment. As you move under the sun, stopping is almost impossible. Discipline was the foundation of this system. Soldiers trained constantly and were kept ready for war. Archery, close combat, and coordinated movement were all part of this training. But war was not just about strength. The Egyptian army was organized and disciplined. On one side, there were trained soldiers. On the other, more irregular forces. This difference could determine the outcome of a battle. At the very top of the army stood the pharaoh. Decisions of war were made in his name. The army did not just fight, it obeyed orders. Imagine being in the middle of battle. Shouts and movements surround you. There is no time to think about what to do. You just move forward. Wars were not fought only to gain land. Captured people were used as labor, so war also affected production. In ancient Egypt, the Nile River was at the center of life. Water, agriculture, and survival all depended on this river. Each year, the flooding waters made the land fertile. So, what would happen if this order were to break? Imagine working along the Nile, wet soil beneath your feet. When the water recedes, a fertile ground remains. But everything depends on this cycle. The Nile was not just a natural resource, it was also a force that had to be controlled. People built canals and systems to direct the water. But nature was not always under control. The banks of the Nile were full of life. On one side, there were green, fertile lands. On the other, a dry, harsh desert stretched on. Life continued along this thin. If the Nile did not flood, life would come to a halt. Farming could not be done, and people would struggle to survive. This was not just a problem, it was a At the end of the day, imagine looking at the river. Everything depends on this water. Life, production, and the future all begin here. Without this river, nothing would be the same. The Nile was not only used for agriculture, but also for transportation. People and goods were carried along this river. So the Nile was also a road. Now, you see this world more clearly. How everything works, who stands where, and how this order remains standing. Everything you see was part of a system. Belief, guides, power, controls, and labor makes everything possible. But this order was not as unbreakable as you think, because everything depends on balance. And when that balance breaks, everything can change. And when the day ends, only what you have done remains. The Nile keeps flowing, But life does not always stay the same. What remains is carved into stone, and today, it still tells us something. So, where would you stand in this world?